So the question of identity, when you capture an image, it tells a story. It doesn't always tell the whole story, obviously. And our ideas of what identity is identity is so much more expansive than our imaginations, actually, and so much more expansive than any checkboxes could ever capture. So one of the things that Elodie spoke about yesterday was representation is so important image by image, but it's a cumulative effect. That is what changes conversation. And even when we started out yesterday, I shared that quote with you about searching for Google images about grounding. And the quote was that when you search for Google images about grounding, you see white feet on sand. When we search for Google images, the representation doesn't exist. When I search for photographers that I want to hire in different places, the photographers that show up at the top of the searches are not diverse, it's usually people who are very well known, very small, like the 85% white male that we were talking about yesterday in the report. And so when we were talking about representation, it is a really, it's very limited in our imaginations. And so what does it mean for us to really expand identity, our notions of identity? And the next panel is going to talk about that. Daniella Zalcman, Marcel, Pardo, Ariza, and Chanell Stone are going to come on up here. They have an exhibit for the image Gardners, which is currently on view at the McEvoy Foundation for the Arts. It's just an 8-minute walk away at the Minnesota Street Project Complex. And we're also so lucky to have the exhibition curator, Sara, Wessen, Chang, moderating this next panel. So thank you all for joining us. Come on up.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and to the whole CatchLight team for having us. I'm very happy to be here to celebrate the Image Gardners exhibition and Marcel's and Chanell's contributions at McEvoy Foundation for the Arts, and I wish Daniella's work was in our exhibition as well. But today we'll be talking about what it means to be an Image Gardner, and Marcel, Chanell, and Daniella, you each are an embodiment of what it means to be an Image Gardner. The term image Gardner emerged in opposition to theories of photography as exploitative, predatory, and, as Susan Sontag said, a voracious way of seeing. And image Gardners instead approach photographic seeing as a means of cultivation and nurturing of both the artist, the subject, and that relationship, resulting in an aesthetic of care. And today, for our discussion, I think we'll cover 4 defining factors of what it means to be an image Gardner. The first, collaboration. The second, experimentation in medium. The third, reappropriation or revision to the historical archive. And the fourth, agency and audience. And so we'll start with collaboration. And so we'll touch on these topics and give these artists a chance to present their work as much as possible, and then we'll dive into a Q&A and get some slides for you. But the first idea of collaboration, image Gardners approach their subjects as collaborators, as partners and participants in the production of an image. And there's a commitment to reciprocity of ideas and also respect there, avoiding any type of objectification, sexualization, neglect, as has been very common. And Marcel, when we first started talking about the show at McEvoy Foundation for the Arts, you mentioned that your idea of a good weekend was gathering all your friends together for a photo shoot and making images. And I just loved that impulse. And the love that you have for your subjects really comes about in your work, which I will show you. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your approach to collaboration or your philosophy there.
Totally. Hi, everyone. My name is Marcel. It's very good to see all of you here today. And I'm very grateful to be with you in real life. I think when I think about collaboration, I think about the history of photography and how much it was not collaborative, and how even the language that we use in photography of like shooting, is kind of like so violent and so colonizing. And for me, photography was a different way of spending time together. So how do we make an archive of our lives that's intentional and thoughtful, and just moving away from a one-time sort of transactional thing where I need to get a story done, so I'm just gonna look for someone, like send me their phone number, contacts, and then never talk to them again, right? So for me, it was really important to have collaborators that I collaborate with multiple times. So the last image that you saw is part of image Gardners at the McEvoy Foundation for the Arts. And this is a collaboration with Fiera, who we met in a club like 5 years ago, and we just sort of started talking to each other before either of us had transitioned. And we've collaborated multiple times, and it sort of is a way of telling not only her story, but also like the stories that we have built together. And so for me, that part of they're just as engaged in the work as I am feels really important. So that's something that I just continue putting in the work. And then the other part of collaboration too is that the more that I apply to grants and funding is that I'm making sure that every single person that's involved in any of my projects gets paid, because I want to honor their time, I want to honor their labor. A lot of the people that I work with are also artists in their own right, so I also want to uplift them in whatever way I can. And financial support is real, especially when it comes to brown and black and queer and trans communities.
Absolutely, thank you. And Daniella, do you want to talk a little bit about how you approach collaboration in your work?
Sure. So this image, along with the one that's on the program cover, is part of an ongoing project called Signs of Your Identity. In stark contrast to most of the photographers we've heard from today and yesterday, I am very much an outsider in this project. I'm not Indigenous, but I have been documenting the legacy of the Indian boarding school and Indian residential school systems in the United States and Canada for almost a decade. And that work started out as double exposure portraits that overlaid these sights and memories of individuals' boarding school experiences with their portraits. For me, that was sort of an important entry point into rethinking the visual process in talking about a story that involves memory and intergenerational trauma. But as the project progressed, I also realized that it was incredibly important for me to cede as much visual authority as I possibly could in continuing to make these images. And I think, that's a hard thing for us as creatives. And I am also a control freak on top of being a creative. And so the idea of handing over authority, handing over sort of creative process is maybe a not necessarily natural one for me. But in the sort of the most recent chapter of the project, I collaborated with 3 Indigenous artists, beadwork artist named Catherine Blackburn, an illustrator named Mo Thunder, and a painter named Greg Deal, and asked each of them, they each have very close personal histories tied to the boarding school system, and asked each of them to elaborate on these portraits in their own way, and through that was attempting to make sure that sort of an Indigenous creative vision was part of this work as well.
Great. They're beautiful images, and I love the incorporation of text as well, which gets us to our second point of experimentation in medium. We've talked a lot about how the medium of photography historically has been very standardized, fixed formats, two-dimensional, and there are increasing trends, as many of you know, to push the boundaries of the medium. And looking at both of your works, I think there are 2 tendencies. One tendency towards increased visibility. Marcel, within your work, with the addition of different materials like vinyl or paint, bold colors, geometric angles, immersive installations. Daniella, in your work with alternative processes in double exposure and in the darkroom, and Chanell with your incorporation of text and poetry, and the second tendency, which Chanell, I think you fall into that tendency, which is a tendency towards invisibility or obscurity. And in the first project I saw by Chanell was Natura Negra, which was at the Museum of African Diaspora, and in some of the works, she overlaid them as this three-dimensional element that obscured half of or portions of the photograph in really beautiful ways. So Chanell, would you like to talk a little bit about how you are experimenting with the medium?
Yeah, thank you for that. I always think about how a two-dimensional object such as a photo is sometimes not enough, and how to make it more of an actual object, something that's three-dimensional, and by incorporating the use of vellum or even text to some degree, it activates the photo outside of just the traditional lineage in order to privilege other themes that just aren't possible with a stale photo, so to speak. And I think it's a way to get certain ideas across, like the idea of memory, what's fading, controlling sight lines, but also the idea of redaction and pulling back certain things. I feel like with identity-based work, there's almost this expectation to over-explain yourself, to over-explain your humanity, and to reveal everything quite literally on the table. And something as small as that can be such a powerful intervention to pull something back. Like, this work is always made for me, my community, my family in mind, and I get to control that a bit, like what I do and don't want to disclose, even if it is subtle, with the image that is there. In real life, the vellum was actually a bit more opaque. In this representation, you kind of can see through it a bit more, but it's this idea of having to work for the image a bit, and again, the use of redaction as a way of refusing a bit while revealing. It's kind of an interesting contrast.
And that's the large portion of the works in the Image Gardners exhibition are kind of fall in this category of shying away from the gaze and with an intentional refusal or denial of that gaze. Marcel or Daniella, do you want to talk at all about experimentation with medium and pushing boundaries there?
Yeah, totally. And I love hearing about your work because I saw it, and then you're getting that perspective. I'm like, oh yes, that's good. It's just always good to get that context in first person. But yeah, I mean, photography is such a new medium, and I have such a love-hate relationship to it because it's so arbitrary, and it kind of just stayed the same for so long, which I never really understood. And then when I started doing it myself and realizing that, framing was expensive, mounting was expensive, doing all this sort of add-ons to make the image more of an object became really inaccessible. So then, I started learning how to frame my own work, and then rectangles, sort of became too boring, too fast. And so then I was playing with different shapes, and in realizing that, then I also started playing more with the sculptural elements of the work and how it could kind of really bring the viewer in a different way. And especially as we are consuming images through our phone most of the time, I also want to add an element that really brings you and invites you to see the exhibition in person, so that we're moved by real life experiences beyond what we see on screens. And so photography sort of becomes this thing where you can make it bigger than life size, you can play with scale in that way, and you can invite viewers to be part of the work as well. And so that's why I like playing with both the vinyl installation, with paint, and really making it a little bit more theatrical, making the audience part of this set. That for me feels like a future narrative that we're sort of shaping together.
Yeah, and it's funny, in some of our earlier conversations, we were talking about the restrictive nature of photography in the fine art context and how little it has changed, and I think it's changed even less in an editorial and photojournalistic context. And when I first started using composites and double exposures in the context of photojournalism, the response from editors was often, that's cool, but this isn't documentary. We can't publish this. We can't use this. And, that's their prerogative. I totally understand that. But at the same time, for me, as long as I am being transparent about my process with the people I photograph, with the people I'm submitting work to, with my audience, I feel completely entitled to want to change and adapt and just rethink the way in which we utilize photographic technology and software. because it feels like it's time, and especially in a lot of the stories that I work on, it felt like straight, the way in which I was trained as a photographer to stand in front of something that's happening, to document it, and then tell a story, it felt like that was too restrictive and it wasn't enough. And particularly in this context, I've used double exposures in multiple projects throughout my career. Sort of initially was protective in the context of LGBTQ rights activists in Uganda whose lives were simultaneously wanted visibility because they were activists and they wanted to be seen, and I was also terrified that I could put them in harm's way. So I initially used it as a protective device, and with Signs of Your Identity, it really came about communicating this sense of the past, this sense of memory, this intergenerational passing on of both story and experience and trauma that I had just completely failed to capture. The first trip I made for this project, when I thought it was connected to a public health crisis, and I made work that I realized was stigmatizing and, excuse my French, was just shitty journalism. And so that's when I went back and realized I have to come up with a different visual language and vernacular for this. It's not going to work otherwise.
Yeah. Oh, could I add something? Something I noticed between each of our practices is this idea of pushing back against inherent power structures in photography, where you have this sort of authority being the photographer. With my work, it's interesting because I'm moving between like being the sitter and the seer. And I think about with your work, Marcel, it's very collaborative, where you're pushing back against that power structure through collaboration and bringing in the voices of your friends and community, and then you privileging like the use of text and whatnot to have like the voice of those people heard. I think that's really powerful and important with photography moving forward, is like the medium doesn't give a voice to the voiceless unless you allow for it, and it is inherently rooted in power. So how do we push back against its inception, basically? But I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I love that too. And I love, Daniella, I just love that you were like, I went and I did this and it didn't turn out the way that I wanted to, and I went and did it again. And generally, because in art spaces and in journalist spaces, like people are just, the pressure is like on your body all the time, right? To get this right, you did this project, this is how you got the grant, this is how you did this. And I really just want more spaciousness for people to realize that maybe the way they're working is actually not sustainable for the people that they're trying to serve, right? Like there's so much social practice projects where people are working with community, and I'm like, but are you really helping the community? That sort of feels exploitative, right? And it's fine, like we all fall back onto certain stereotypes because that's kind of how we all have learned, right? But I think that allowing ourselves to be like, I did that project and it just didn't turn out that right for what I want to do, and I want to do it again. And it feels so humbling to hear you say that, because I've been in that moment too, where I'm like, oh, I'm really trying to give this person a voice, and maybe this is not the right way to do it. So maybe I can include them in a project in a way that feels comfortable for them.
I love that, and just this idea of giving back the voice to those that might have, to people or histories that might have been erased or suppressed in the past. And that brings us to the third topic of reappropriation or revision to the historical archive. And each of you are utilizing the historical archive in such interesting ways, and as a means to reconcile or revive those voices, those lives and those stories. I think, Chanell, with your work and reconciling your family's history with slavery, racism, Daniella, this story, which I think is incredible, the way that you've interlaid these interiors, photographs of interiors where these injustices took place, with the silhouettes of those that lived them or are experiencing the trauma from those times. Do we want to touch on historical archive at all, Daniella, or anyone can jump in?
Maybe Marcel first. I know you have a deep connection to this.
Sure. In 2018, I did a project for a show at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, and I moved to the Bay Area 8 years ago, and so I was considering the queer history of the Bay Area, and so I spent a lot of time in the GLBT Historical Society archives looking through queer archives, mostly because the idea of a queer archive in a building felt very moving to me, just because thinking about where I'm from in Colombia, of like a queer archive being taken care of felt rather rare. And so I spent a lot of time in the archive, and I saw these photographs that were in dusty archival boxes. And so I just wanted to create a project that was about inviting those from the archive back. And so what I did was scan them and printed them life size, and then photograph them with queers living here today, and sort of having this juxtaposition of trans-historical kinship. So honoring those that came before us, and even though we didn't personally knew them, right? So kind of having this, and the way that I wanted to do it was emphasizing gestures of care and connection, and so people, and like touch, as this way of kind of putting two generations together that have gone through a lot of grief too. So I really love, also kind of questioning this idea of photography as being one moment in time, right? And kind of putting those two in one single image.
Yeah, and I think I work maybe in opposition to the historical archive. I think a lot of my projects and a lot of the histories that I'm most interested in are things that weren't necessarily made part of our canonical understanding of who we are, of our own country's history, of how the legacies of colonization have shaped our understanding of social and political and economic structures. So sometimes, and again, I'm a non-Indigenous person working in these spaces, but the historical body of work that has been made of Indigenous people in North America has historically almost exclusively been made by non-Indigenous people working in pretty extractive and unethical ways. So attempting to instead focus on the specific stories that we should know and don't, versus the ones that we continue to share that are deep mythologies like Thanksgiving and the role of Christopher Columbus. I think that maybe is sort of my relationship to the archive and the way in which I like to interact with those histories.
Yeah, to that end, I feel like my practice is rooted in something similar, where it's the idea of who is omitted from a national archive and what stories are being told and not told. And that led me to look at my own family archive and pushing back against this idea of an institutional archive and just looking at what is it that my family has collected, because that for me is more affirming than what I learned in history books about being a Black American and in relation to the American landscape. It's just, there's so much more outside of the narrative of slavery. So that led me to speak to my grandmothers, who are pretty much the historians in the family, and they're the ones that cultivated this archive of images that's like probably hundreds of pictures, and just relying on oral histories to inform that. So I've seen myself as building on an archive that pre-existed in my family and just continuing it. I think sometimes we think an archive is just rooted in the past, but it's actually building itself in the present. And I think about this idea of collapsing time a bit with photography, because it is of the past, but it is of the present. It's an interesting dichotomy. And just actively keeping that archive alive, because it is alive and there's so many stories to be pulled from there. So yeah.
Great, thank you so much. And the fourth topic that I wanted to touch on is agency and authorship. It's been fascinating just over the past couple of years to watch the art world shift and watch hierarchies of power disintegrate slightly as with the increase of social media and more artist-run galleries, artist-run spaces, NFTs, and as artists and photographers gain more access, gain more control over their agency, over their self-image, they're also gaining access to its distribution and those audiences as well. And which brings me to this question of who is this work for? Who is the intended audience?
Yeah, I can start. I feel like my intended audience is my community, so it's made for the Black community. I really push back against what I said earlier about like over-explaining my experience or my humanity. It's not about that. So it's made with that in mind, and then of course it's open for others to pull something from it, engage with it. But I never want the work to be didactic, because again, that's putting this belief in needing a dominant culture, needing to justify yourself to a dominant culture, and I just don't believe in that at all. So I don't lose sight of that in the work, and it's also following my own curiosities too, just as an artist, things that matter to me. But I feel like with the work, at least with my work, it's individual, but also collective. So I feel like I'm motivated by something outside of myself too. And sometimes that could be misconstrued with like self-portraiture, thinking it's just like you wanting to kind of be in the limelight or something. But no, I feel like I act as a conduit for something bigger than me. So yeah, that's what I think about.
Yeah, I feel like I keep thinking about, I didn't really have like a model of what it was like to be an older queer trans person until I moved to California, and then I had some mentors that took me under their wing that gave me access to resources, and to me, like, I just wish I had that sooner. And so when I make this body of work, it is for like younger trans generations to see themselves represented in media beyond hate crimes, beyond like anti-trans violence. We see, especially in this year, we've seen such an increase in hate crimes towards trans folks, especially brown and black women of color. And to me, I just want to make work about trans excellence. I want to make work about trans joy. I see so many incredible work being made by trans organizers and activists, and I want that work to be celebrated too. And so all that to say that I want that plethora of like media representation where you're seeing people thrive, because you need to see yourself as this kind of moving beyond what you as a percentage of something that can happen to you. And I want to do that, with people who are living that experiences themselves, and I want to do it so it's fun and it's like glamorous and people want to be part of it. Like, we're going to make trans irresistible so that no one can harm us,
And I think for me, I think about it in two parts. I mean, I consider my first and greatest responsibility to the people I photograph and the people who trust me with their stories, to people who allow me into their lives and their histories. Often, and you've seen maybe some of these excerpts, are sharing extremely complicated, traumatic recollections from their childhood. And so if they don't feel comfortable and happy and safe in the way that I've chosen to represent them, then I've failed and I have to start over. But at the same time, I also deeply want this work to be educational. And my primary target is children, is teenagers. I'm currently teaching at the University of Montana this semester. And like Jillian, I have a parent who is radically conservative and who I, can, no matter what I do, can't get her to empathize with a lot of the stories that deeply matter to me. But I talk to students, I talk to 10 to 12 to 14 to 18-year-olds, and they immediately listen and connect and draw connections to their own histories, and they feel something very deep for either we have to change this, we have to make sure we know about this, we have to do better. And I think that, I joke that rage motivates almost all of the stories and projects I've ever worked on. It's true, and I also want to inspire rage in other people, because that sounds a little unhealthy maybe, but I think that we have a lot to be angry about, and it's important, particularly in the context of education, to make sure that we are reframing how we understand our own histories, particularly in the United States. So I think I approach it from those double perspectives.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, piggybacking off of that, with the work that's in image Gardners, I made that work in the Deep South, and that was part of this idea of what I said, like keeping that archive alive and like going back to the places where my grandparents are from. And I just think about, while I'm dealing with complicated histories that are complex, where two things could be true at the same time, it's a history of violence and bloodshed there as it relates to the Black American body, but I'm also dealing with potentialities and possibilities in that land now that so much time has passed. Like, so much of that history is still alive and well. It's not really of the past, it's living and playing itself out in the present, but I don't lose sight of like, what are other potentials and what are other stories that are still here waiting to be told at the same time. And I think that's something that's beautiful about photography, is the aspirational qualities of it. And that's the way my grandmothers used it and people in my family. And I try to do that while wrestling with these darker histories too, is like the aspirational quality. I feel like you said that, Marcel, as well, with wanting to make it irresistible and what you were saying as well. But I just don't lose sight of that too. I think that's important.
Yeah, I'm so comforted by the fact that Daniella and Marcel, you both are teaching, and Chanell, I have no doubts that you will be teaching very soon, and just this priority for continued pedagogy and representation in all of your work. So that gives me a lot of hope. We can continue, or we can also open it up for a couple questions.
Don't be shy, ask a question.
I feel so proud just seeing this panel because I feel that this is the future of this medium and this whole, little game that we're playing. My question is, what do you see what kind of future can we actually dream in this medium? And what does that look like 10, 15 years from now? Are we gonna have a summit again and talk about the same things, or we're gonna be past that? Like, what do you envision for that?
What kind of future? Is that what you said?
The future for the medium of visual storytelling, lens-based storytelling.
I have so many thoughts about this, so I'll keep it short. But just normalizing these sorts of topics, like there's no reason why these experiences that we're talking about, be it Black, Indigenous, trans, like why that can't be a part of the major canon of photography and not siloed as these individual categories. I believe like there's a lot of overlap in what we're talking about. As we said, like the anchor of this talk is about representation, but the future to me is what I just said, it becoming normalized where these perspectives are just here permanently and not for a time. That's something I think about.
Yeah, when you think about like the future of the medium, the first thing that I think about like is that right now we're seeing, the diversity on the panels that we see and artists in shows. But when I still look at every single institution that deals with photography, especially with leadership, I don't see a lot of color. And so I want, the directors of art institutions to be Black, brown, people of color. I want them to be queer and trans people. And I think we need to move beyond a conversation where, people are talking about diversity and equity and inclusion as like this singular sort of position. But I think all of those seats at the table need to be occupied by someone else. And so that's a future that I really would like to see, because I've worked in nonprofits, tech companies, teach, the academy, and I keep seeing the same faces. And, they're all perfectly nice. We just need to see other people. It's our time. And then, when we talk about philanthropy and projects, I also want to see more projects that are unrestricted funds. So projects and grants where we don't require to have an evaluation process, where I have to tell you what I did, but you can see it, in the work that I'm doing, because that's actually how projects get done, right? Because sometimes in philanthropic projects, all of these bureaucratic things become more the work than letting the work be. So all that to say that I want all these structures to be a little bit more malleable and more forgiving and more inclusive of who is a part of that. Through really honest conversations.
Also ideas of equity. It's like inclusion is not enough. We have to think about what does equity look like for marginalized groups. And something that I commended Sara for was that with this exhibition, which is focused on women and non-binary artists, is kind of extrapolating like what does that mean and breaking that down. Because oftentimes where you hear terms like that, there's no POC in the room. Like that's like a coded word. It's like when I would go to exhibitions that were for women photographers, I would not see any Black women represented. And I'm like, am I not a woman as well? Like, why is this perspective not here? But we opened it up even more to include non-binary perspectives. And I just think things like that is like also important for the future photography moving forward. It's just broadening that and making sure equity and inclusion is at the center of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily optimistic that this will happen within my lifetime, but I want this panel to be rendered obsolete and unremarkable. I want Women Photograph to not have to exist anymore. I want Diversify Photo and the Authority Collective and Indigenous Photograph. Like, we should not need to exist because it will be so normalized that everyone will hire and publish and support and fund photographers who are relevant to the stories they are hoping to document, that we'll have a healthy mix of insiders and outsiders telling all stories, that we will just do these things naturally and normally and not have to be reminded, not have to be yelling at people on Twitter, not have to put out industry reports with statistics to remind people that things are still very bad. You know, I think eventually that in some utopic world where we solve all of these problems in 200 years, that we just won't have to have these conversations anymore because it'll be our reality one day.
Some of that is through like bridge building between certain canons of photography. Like, the more connections that we see between different perspectives would be great, and the longevity of curation remaining inclusive, because sometimes it can be checking a box. Like, okay, we did a show that had this, we did that. And that's so problematic, and we're seeing that, you know, in the institutions, but also in editorial. It just, so pushing back against that too would be great. Like, I think that's what we're all just saying, like normalizing it rather than, you know, that approach.
And I think on the positive side, like all these things, all the things we've talked about this weekend, that they become just integral, institutionalized parts of our practice, that we don't have to remark about, oh, your work is grounded in care, that all of our work be grounded in care, that be a standard for the industry, that, you know, all of these different ethical rules that we have in place, that care become the foregrounding consideration of all of those things, not just did you pay a person to photograph them, that is not our biggest concern and priority.
Yes, another question?
This question is for Marcel. You mentioned you really like to incorporate compensation for the people you're photographing into grants and things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about that, why that's important, and like your process and how you overcome any kind of pushback, because there is a little bit of pushback in certain areas of photography for that type of work?
Do you mind repeating the first part?
The compensation for the people you photograph?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I started thinking about that because, you know, I was doing a lot of things in the community too, and I was really stretched thin, helping a lot of folks out, which I'm happy to do that with friends, but I feel like the moment that I started, you know, applying for funding, then something felt wrong to me to ask people to come to my studio and then to get a check for myself. And you know, we're talking about very little budgets in comparison to like what is like a livable wage for everyone. But I feel like for me, I much rather be, you know, sort of like broke with everyone than rich on my own. And especially when we're thinking about, you know, I keep thinking about Paris is Burning as this documentary that it's so important that we all watch, that like a lot of people have watched, you know, featuring like brown and black, like trans people in New York in the 80s, and it was made by two women who were white, and they became very successful, and the documentary is incredible. But a lot of the folks that were participating in this documentary, you know, they weren't so lucky. They didn't get to like have and appreciate that level of wealth, and that to me just sit in this place where I get to make my own moral decisions about my work, and to me, that's only just like one portion, right? Like this happens when I'm making the work. If I have the budget, I can do this. And I agree with Daniella that like we shouldn't even have to think it just about money in this transactional way. But we're talking about sustainability. So if I'm working with someone for a long period of time, like I also want to honor that. But then I'm also starting to think about it like whenever I sell work, like what's a percentage that can go back to people that are part of it throughout the time, and also just thinking about that, you know, with collections, of just like always having people's back, you know, every time I'm sort of exhibiting the work, having people's consent. And I think we talked about this too, where people always talk about like media release forms and people being like, okay, I have your consent to put my work. And I think we just need to move away from consent being permanent, right? Because it's not. And I need to accept that like if I photograph someone who's in the middle of transitioning and 10 years pass by and they will ask me, hey, I don't feel comfortable about you using that photo anymore, and I have to be okay about not exhibiting that work ever again. And that to me feels something that I'm willing to do because I want to respect the people that are part of my work. But I know that like in the past, photography has been like, yeah, let's get the media release form, and then I'll do whatever I want, you know? So just kind of the moral and ethics, they're changing all the time. I think about it often. I talk with people because there's not really a formula to make it, you know, like ethical, right? You have to have these conversations constantly. Did that answer your question? Pushback from my collaborators? Oh, I mean, I think that for me it's always about a sort of compromise in all the sides, right? So when I'm talking about changing something in an institution, you know, I've been in places where people are like, we should pay the artist $500 for this thing. And I'm like, would you do that for $500? They're like, no, maybe I'll do it for like 3,000. I'm like, well, should we make it 3,000? They're like, yeah. I'm like, wow, it just took me asking this question for you to reconsider what the honorarium for this artist should be. Just you putting yourself in that place. So, and for me, it's perfectly fine to make those conversations amicable, right? We don't need to, I think that conflict will arise, but I'm not interested in any sort of confrontational conflict. I'm just interested in making it better for everyone who's involved.
Any other questions? We got one in the back.
Hey, so, you know, I feel like right now we're seeing this kind of polarizing moment where like you're seeing on places like TikTok and stuff, there's like this really vibrant, you know, diversity that is incredible and worth seeing. And in contrast to it, you have these, you know, a lot of people in this country that are not just disagreeing with these ideas, but often making it feel unsafe. You know, some parts of this country, people are at risk for expressing themselves, for their gender, their sexuality. And I'm just curious, do you have advice to the youth about how they can make grassroots efforts to remain visible despite this kind of polarizing environment, and how institutions can maybe support them and make sure that they continue to have a voice when some people are maybe trying to take that away?
Was this open-ended, or was it specific to someone on the panel?
Any of you, really.
What? It's open-ended. Can you repeat it one more time?
Just you know, I think we're seeing like a lot of joy and vibrance and expression from people in our community that really deserve to have more of the spotlight, time in the press, time in publications, time in exhibitions. But there's this contrasting political situation where, you know, there's a lot of anti-trans rhetoric in the United States today that makes it feel often unsafe. You know, they don't feel like they can be themselves. And I'm curious if you have advice to people who are affected by this to, like, are there grassroots efforts they can take to remain visible as a lot of people in this country are trying to make it feel as if they shouldn't be?
I mean, I can speak to that a little bit, unless you all want to. I feel like I've spoken a lot, so. I mean, I think we all have a sense of when we feel like we're under attack, and when we need to speak up, and when we can't. And I want people to follow that instinct of whenever they don't feel safe, that's maybe not a moment where you need to fight for what you need to fight, right? And maybe that's the moment that you need in order to feel inspired enough to organize with your friends to do it, right? So, I mean, I don't have the complete answers to this, but I can speak for myself in terms of like there have been moments where I'm walking in the street back home and, you know, I might holding my partner's hand and I'm like, maybe this is a moment where we don't hold each other's hand. This is a moment where we kind of I'm gonna try to pass more, and maybe you're gonna act this way so that we pass as a straight couple, you know? So I've definitely had to play that, because you cannot be your fullest self all the time, and that's something that we learn, right? It's like, how do you navigate? But then I'm also now in a moment where I feel like I can be fully myself out, and I have a job and as a trans person, and that kind of blows my mind. So I can also speak up about other things that maybe people don't feel so safe speaking about. I don't know if other folks have any comments on that.
Yeah, I think about a simple gesture could just be making the work on like a small grassroots level, just telling the stories that you want to tell that reflect you, no matter what the national sentiment is. And that could be done privately, right? We don't know where the work will live later, but the simple act of wanting to tell your story and document your experience is powerful. Yeah, I think about safety too, like with this body of work that we're referring to that's in McEvoy right now. That was made in the South, and like being from a coastal city, like being from LA, like it's different navigating making work there as a Black individual versus going to the Deep South, like Mississippi, where there are Confederate flags everywhere. And literally, I was approached several times with like racist rhetoric when I was making the work, and I was really scared to be there. So it's interesting, like how being your fullest self could be dictated by the region you're in, and how you revert back to a certain survivalist mentality, depending where you are in this country even. And yeah, when I'm there, I'm not by myself. I'm with like close friends, because I'm aware of the dynamic. Gender roles come up, and race, when I'm in there, in those spaces like the Deep South. So again, I agree with like what Marcel's saying is like sussing it out for yourself. But I think that's when it comes back to the idea of community and collaboration. Like, this work isn't made alone, even if it is a self-portrait. Like, there's a lot of forces behind it protecting me to tell this story. And just nationally, like the pushback against certain narratives. Like, in the South right now, there's a lot of erasure happening of Black history. And some people don't want to hear these other narratives. They want to act like it's not happening, but just having the wherewithal within yourself to like stand on what it is you believe and want to speak to. So it's different things that are negotiated in real time.
And I think it's also important to remember we all have different roles. We all have different personalities and levels of comfort. And some people want to fight and be very vocal and outspoken and visible, and some people don't. And there are ways, I mean, it's both are perfectly valid, and there are ways to contribute and make really meaningful work on either end of that spectrum. So yeah, I mean, understanding safety and what that means for yourself and your body and your community, and understanding what you want your role to be as an artist is, I think that like that's a constant conversation for all of us, of that point, that particular kind of positionality, and it's an important thing to constantly be checking in on, I think.
Yeah, and I'll just say one more thing is, if you also with trans youth specifically, is that, yeah, like knowing that they're not alone, that there's like resources for them made by other people, and then when is your role as an ally to also make someone feel safe? That's really when everyone's, can come in there, depending on our positionality, and I feel like being less of a bystander in those situations can really help someone else when they're feeling under attack.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. I think we'll end there. If you could help me give a round of applause to our panelists and the CatchLight team. Thank you all.